Hi, it's Steve Hargadon and Reed Hepler, and we're here this week in AI. Today's the first day, Reed, of our professional productivity boot camp, which just
Yes,
keeps
it
you and me
is.
busy. But it's interesting. I feel like in the last few weeks, there's been a dramatic shift in my use of AI toward productive. There was a lot of fun with the AI, and I was really enjoying it, but it really got productive for me in a unique way in the last few weeks. Have you experienced anything of the same?
Well, it seemed like there have been a lot of different ways to use AI, and so our news articles for this week just kind of demonstrate that people are applying the principles of AI to a wide variety of topics, and so it seems like everybody's focusing on the productivity part, just in different ways. And it's interesting to see what ideas people have, like how people's work culture, how people's work ethic affects how they use AI. So yes, I've noticed that I've actually been more conscientious, and I've been kind of focusing more on my prompts and refining my prompts before I give it to the AI. And so yeah, that's kind of thing that I've been noticing in the past week or 2 weeks. Yeah.
I've definitely noticed that having the ability to talk to it by voice, so ChatGPT, introducing the easy ability to just interact back and forth with voice, and
Mhm.
Perplexity in the last couple of days, that I'm using it for things I didn't think I would use it for,
Yeah.
like how to use a particular appliance I bought several years ago that I lost the manual for, and
Uh-huh.
sort of the brilliance of that, and just and the sort of the constant companionship of having this ready reference friendly librarian next to me.
Well, and that's interesting too, because and I didn't include this in our articles for this week because it wasn't really news, but there's a growing emphasis among librarians on using AI for conversational search rather than database search. And a lot of librarians who used to be anti any use of AI in information finding, they're promoting it, using AI for conversational search because it actually helps people search better. Students have found that they can find things easier if they have a conversation rather than to use keywords and Boolean stuff. And yeah, so
I did have a conversation with Perplexity yesterday that produced some great books that I didn't even know existed that I really want to read. But by the same token, I had a conversation with ChatGPT that hallucinated a complete book. It just doesn't exist.
it can, yeah.
We're still there. Okay, do you want to take us through the news?
Yes. So the news this week we're going to go over obviously the stuff that went over here in education, in content creation, and also in the discrepancies between what companies claim and what is the reality. And then we're going to do a deep dive into AI and genetics. So the first thing, and this is kind of um, interesting. So Google has always said that Gemini has been like the top tier AI in analyzing data. But apparently, according to researchers and practitioners who've used it, Gemini's data analyzing abilities are not nearly as good as Google claims. And this is from a site called TechCrunch, and they obviously are really good at looking at the data instead of looking at what companies claim. They're saying that Gemini is not, and there was a recent study, or not a recent study, but another article that said that um, Bing also, the Bing Copilot was not as good at analyzing data and being as accurate. And I know a lot of practitioners lately have been saying that Bing is slowly becoming less accurate. And so it's interesting that as we have all these companies vying and they're having claims that it's becoming more and more, I think, kind of one of the main things people are doing, the first things is that they're analyzing the data processing powers of these tools. And that used to be kind of an afterthought for a lot of people, but I think now it's let's verify the claims. Is what they're saying can be done actually available to me? And a lot of them are falling short. I know that a similar thing happened 2 months ago with the rabbit. I'm in a rabbit subreddit on Reddit, the Rabbit R1, and the rabbit fell so far short of what it promised. And so it seems like a lot of these AI companies now they're not doing it because they know obviously that they can get caught, but they're promising things that cannot happen, at least not now.
I feel
So
like there's got to be an enormous amount of pressure in those companies to spin the positive. You're
yeah,
you're you're job, you're, everybody's wanting things. So I could see that there would be an inherent culture of optimism and positivity that could sometimes bleed into the promises that you make. And I think we've seen that with some of the demo videos where people say, that's not really, it doesn't really work as well as you've claimed it has. The other thing I'm interested in, Reed, is large language models weren't built for logic, and we're expecting them to do a lot of logic. So is
Yeah.
this just a disconnect with the fundamental technology and the expectations?
Well, I think we're going to talk about this a little bit in the professional productivity bootcamp today, but I think a lot of it is a misconception about what the AI can do and what it's meant to do. Because a lot of people do want it to be logical and they want to analyze data without them telling things, but you really have to have the human in there. I think it is a disconnect because the human has to be in control of the conversation. They have to have the data, they have to have the info, the context. A lot of people are just things out there, putting it in and not giving it any context, giving it like a one sentence prompt, and then they're saying, ooh, it didn't work. So I think there's a lot more we could be doing to make it better.
Great.
But in
Keep
this
going.
case, with Gemini, I
Yeah.
mean, there's not really much that you can do to improve data analysis abilities. Like that's on Google, I feel like.
Interesting. Okay, what's next?
So the next thing is that we have, um, and a lot of people have been doing this in different ways, but it's called Eternal You. It is a AI product that can kind of, I think that there's been a Black Mirror episode about this. There's been a few movies. It can take your likeness, um, and it can bring comfort to you. Um, it, I mean, I don't know why people would really want to do this.
I actually am not
Um,
surprised by this at all. I think that if you have a body of text messages, you have correspondence, you have video, and it can produce a likeness that brings back the feelings of being with someone. It's probably not, you're probably going to start misremembering somebody if this becomes a thing, meaning whatever
yeah.
the AI representation of the person is may become your primary representation of them in your mind. And I'm pretty sure I've seen a science fiction movie that's like that. But this doesn't surprise me at all. And if you're missing somebody and you'd like to hear their voice, uh, I, I can see the fun aspect of it, and I can also see the emotional fulfillment aspect of it.
Hmm. Um, Chrome is not responding, but I do know that there have been a lot of, I mean, the the ability of AI to withstand people's perceptions and to change their perceptions is kind of crazy because another news thing that occurred was that AI can now pass the Turing test at a greater rate than humans can. And so that's kind of interesting too. Speaking of AI being able to change people's perceptions, that not only can it pass the Turing test, which is a testament to its ability to change perceptions, but it actually has better perceptions now about other AI tools than humans. Once I get my Chrome to respond, I'm
So
very irritated at it, then it will.
we're waiting on that. So we've got this sort of crossover of AI becoming more like humans and humans becoming less capable. So this is a crossover point. The Turing test level may change or the singularity point may change. Um, I do think there's behind that story, there's another interesting story, which is what did calculators do to our mathematical ability? Certainly calculators democratized number crunching in a lot of ways, but did calculators reduce our ability to do numeric calculations, to think in terms of math? Will the ready capacity of AI to answer questions reduce our intellectual capacity on the whole? For some people, it's going to be just a great augmentation and a really great way to go further than you could have gone. But if just any regular person can get the kind of response that a PhD level candidate would normally give, will that actually reduce the incentive to think deeply and to be able to do these things ourselves?
Well, I think that it's a frightening idea because you never know what's going to um, what skill is going to be de-skilled next a little bit, because it is a lot of people are becoming more dependent on AI, and that's even scary. It seems like we're kind of going from one news story to the other more naturally. It's really nice because the Los Angeles Unified School District created a chat bot. It's called All Here, and I believe it was for just um, Los Angeles School District information,
Well, I
but
think that they'd actually tested it on other it was Los Angeles wasn't their only customer,
okay.
but it was for the parents and the students, uh, or and at least for the parents and the students. I know that they were the primary audience for being able to ask about grades and homework and the like. And the company went bankrupt, I think, right?
It did go bankrupt, but it also said that there was data
Oh,
privacy issues.
compromised.
But I know they were going to, yeah, okay, family engagement. Um, and okay, so that's just kind of one step away from a content chat bot, I think. And if they're using it for information about the district, they can use it for information about their classes or another tool. And so that just kind of speaks more to, well, we can, I mean, AI dependency. I mean, it's
Mhm.
already making people become AI dependent for information about their district. People aren't using their, calling people. They're using the chatbot, which can make mistakes. So many issues, and I think
Yeah.
this is one area where, um, like, it's good to have a human, especially when it comes to your kids, stuff about your kids. Um,
It
and
may
so,
not be fair, but Los Angeles has a pretty bad reputation for spending lots of money on technology that doesn't actually improve student outcomes.
oh,
But
okay,
I can
interesting.
see the temptation, right? The
Yeah.
temptation is, oh, this is going to solve it. Everybody gets excited. We're going to do this. But tackling both the capacity of a chatbot to provide information and the privacy issues around students feels
Mhm.
like, again, I don't know the story in depth, but it feels like those are two enormous challenges to put together so early on, right? I'm
Yes.
sure they got excited. They were excited to sell it. They were excited to buy it, but it does feel like it was a little early to take on that level of responsibility, given the difficulty of the task.
Mhm. Well, and I mean, there's a lot of people, and we'll see. We have a lot of state government people coming to our boot camp today. But there was a news thing. Was it the Guardian or was it the Daily Mail in Great Britain? And it was talking about, is AI the answer for better government services? Because um, Tony Blair, former prime minister, says that it is. And obviously, this is Great Britain. We're in the United States, but obviously the answer, at least for school district chatbots, is no, not yet, at least. But Tony Blair and the British government, at least the former, seem to think that it is. Um, Last week, or this week rather, he released a report. His institute released a report on AI, and it said that AI is wonderful. It will help reduce the time spent on tasks by the workforce by 1/5 of the time. It will help automate around 40% of the jobs. But that data was actually created by AI. They put it into ChatGPT and they said, ChatGPT says this, so it must be true. And so just kind of combining and then that article of, is the AI the answer for better government services, came out, because if they're not going to help business the way that, is it going to, it could replace politicians allegedly. But I think it's interesting that everybody is wanting to automate things. Everybody's wanting to just use technology without carefully considering it. And I mean, that's a national report by a former prime minister who's still a politician, who's talking about public policy in Great Britain. I don't know much about Great Britain public policy, but still someone who's higher than public eye. And he used AI to do something and didn't vet it and just put it out there for the whole nation and the whole world to see. So
Some great themes here. So I think that, Reed, the theme of today's show seems to be that uh, I think it's really reasonable to believe that chatbots are going to help us in a lot of bureaucratic kind of information activities, whether it's finding out your kid's attendance at school or things that mundane kind of routine tasks that data can provide responses to.
Yeah.
But I think it's reasonable to believe that a lot of the bureaucracy of government will in fact be streamlined by having access to chatbots. It already works for me on some commercial sites that I go to where I know I'm interacting with a chatbot. It's not perfect, and it's often not nearly as good as a human, but it will get better. But the other half of that theme is the rush to be the first ones and the rush to make the promises. So from the large companies promising what AI is going to be able to do to the schools and the vendors and the politicians, there's such a desire to be at the forefront that being careful about these stories is probably the best position right now. Just to realize people are going to have incentive to exaggerate.
Yeah, yeah. People, well, because people don't like the the like the lukewarm stuff, gradual changes, things that don't have a lot of impact. So exaggerating is the way to do that. Speaking on a slightly different topic now about Google searches and database searches, not really well, search engine searches mostly. Google's AI overviews have caused a bit of a ruckus. In the last week there were two news articles about that at least. The AI overviews have led to a drop in mobile searches. So people aren't searching Google. I think personally, well, that either it's because of them not wanting to do the Google overview, or because they know that the AI can that AI can do it, that AI can give them the answer anyway. I think it's a combination. Why go to Google when you can have ChatGPT tell you, first of all? Second of all, why go to Google when the AI overview is going to be so awful? And a related thing to that, there was a group of content creators, especially those who were in the front pages and the first results on common Google searches. They're very concerned about AI overviews taking over the attention of people and them not going to the sites. There was the headline on one of the articles was her guacamole recipe tops Google. She fears AI will change that, but that's just indicative of so many other people who, if people go into the AI overview,
Yeah.
they're not going to go to they're not going to go to the sites. And I've told uh, Maddie, and I do it, and I told my coworkers and everybody, really, just skip over the AI overview, because first, I mean, it's interesting because they have the AI overview first, and then they have the most relevant website, a summary of that, the highlighted part next, which is more accurate than this one, and then they have the sites. So at least when it was just the most relevant website quoted and bolded, you knew it was coming from an actual website. But
I have two different feelings about this. One of which is when I do a search, I'm actually looking for the answer. And so a traditional Google search is a two-step process. I do the
yeah,
search, it gives me a list of possible sites that are going to have answers that closely approximate the word matching. But then I've got to go to the second step of going to that site. So the overview for me often actually solves something. It simplifies the steps. I want the answer, not to have to drill down. At the same time, you and I've talked about this, the sort of the death of expertise. These are the worst search overviews we're ever going to have. They're going to get better, right?
yeah,
And as they get better, even if they're footnoted, as long as I get the answer, why would I go to the woman's site with the guacamole recipe?
that's true.
If the
Yeah,
overview is going to give me the recipe, that's what I need. If I'm doing a voice interaction with ChatGPT and I say, hey, I need the best guacamole recipe, and ChatGPT says, or Google says, take this and add this and do this, I'm not going to go to the site. So the person who's been incentivized to publish their expertise by getting clicks or some other form of revenue is going to lose that benefit. So I do think the theme of the death of expertise is very real and something to be concerned with. So yeah, these Google overviews are clearly so flawed from the beginning, but at the same time, I do think it makes sense that when we want the answer, we will choose the technology that gives us the answer without the multiple steps to get there.
yeah, yeah. And it's all about, it's all about saving those multiple steps and not doing it. I mean, that's what all technology is a little bit. They're trying to give you instant access. And I had a related experience yesterday with vendor services, or well, not vendor services, but like um, our library content management service at CSI, where one of the main selling points was that they could get at us anywhere in the system within 2 clicks, rather than the typical 3 or 6. It was amazing, but that's kind of what people are trying to do with AI. The final two news articles we have, well, actually, one is in a news article. It's my blog,
Yeah.
called "We Haven't Gone as Far as We Can Go." It's a reference, obviously, to Oklahoma, and it talks about that we need to do better about fact checking. We need to do better about making sure we're not being reliant or dependent on AI tools, because it's going to be a big thing. I talk about the Tony Blair's thing, and I also talk about the last article that we're going to talk about, which is, and it's not really an article because it was an email that was sent to me, not a website, but Illicit has created a way that they can show that Illicit is 90% confident, not accurate, 90% confidence in its accuracy, because that's going to make you feel so much better about using it and relying on it. So I
So
can't, it's just so empty.
the Dunning-Kruger effect in AI, right?
Yeah, yes, exactly. It's not about accuracy, it's about how confident is it. And that's really focused on the data, not about whether the context or anything. It's just bizarre. Anyway, so they will give, and also to get this heightened accuracy, you have to be paying for Illicit Plus, not Illicit Basic,
Yeah.
Illicit Plus, and you have to turn on high accuracy mode, because why would anyone want high accuracy to begin with?
You have
And
to pay for
so
it.
you have to turn this button on, you have to subscribe, you have to subscribe to the third tier, and you have to look for the check marks, which to be fair, in my opinion, the check marks are useless. So it's just kind of funny that we're being so reliant. We are relying, and the process that they use is they use AI to assess an AI's assessment of the accuracy of the AI summaries. So it's like AI, inception, and that's what they're basing it on. So we really are being dependent, not on one AI, but on like 5 or 6. So yeah.
I think there's a deeper human theme here, right? Which
Mhm.
is we will choose ease over accuracy or appropriateness or responsibility. As a human beings as a whole, we choose ease over responsibility. So we may know that certain kinds of chemicals or plastics or other things harm the environment, but we're going to pick up that thing in the store that's easy for us and justify away the harder decisions. We're just not good at making large group decisions about things that have a long-term impact, right? So the ease or accuracy, these AIs are going to get more accurate, right?
Mhm.
Whether or not you're having to pay an additional fee for the accuracy. Oh, I'd like to chat with an inaccurate chatbot. No one's going to say that, right? But
Uh-huh.
they are going to get more accurate. And as they get more accurate, they're we're going to, I think there's an inevitable, I think we need to understand there's an inevitability to human behavior that we will choose ease over responsibility. And so that's, the expecting people to decide together, hey, we can't do this because it's not going to be good for us or for the environment or for the intellectual ecosystem. That might be expecting too much. I am hopeful that there are places here where legislation is appropriate.
Yes, hopefully that's the
We
goal.
need to do something like that. So we've touched on the Amish theme. We didn't call it out again, but this idea that evaluating the impact of the technology, that's sort of that Amish theme that you and I talk about. And we've talked about the death of expertise. I want to add to our framework list, or at least our discussions about the framework list, this sort of ease versus responsibility, because I do think it's the same thing that's going on with these companies when they make promises that they're really not able to deliver.
Mhm.
It's this desire to have something right now rather than the harder task of building over time.
Mhm. Well, yeah, I mean, and it'll be interesting. I'm convinced that we're going to come to this productivity series, and there are going to be people, obviously, who want to do automation, who want to, find out how they can just offhand everything to AI, and we're going to say that's not what you're going to do. And yeah, the ease versus responsibility is going to be a huge component, I think. And I might share the illicit checkmark story sometime, because it's just bizarre. It's just, why would you trust that so much? And so a deep dive, oh, sorry.
Before we leave that illicit check mark, you had a stronger reaction to it than I did. Meaning, I don't think it's unreasonable to believe that AI will be able to help us with AI. So ultimately, if AI can help, if a artificial general intelligence helps to develop an artificial super intelligence, right? I think that there's a reasonable degree to which AI will be able to help develop AI. So I don't think it's unreasonable to think that AI would be able to help fact check. And maybe an example of that would be I built a custom GPT and I preloaded it with books that took a particular spin on a topic and a topic that's often difficult to get good and honest answers from ChatGPT about. So I gave it books that had examples of places where there had been historical misrepresentations of things that had actually taken place. And I said, given the Lusitania and the beginning of the Vietnam War and the beginning of the Iraq War and these other sort of basic examples, can we do a better job of evaluating current news stories from the perspective of skepticism rather than being labeled a conspiracy theorist? So the healthy skepticism that you would have in a democratic society. And what I found was ChatGPT then did a really good job of responding to particular stories. So if you have the ability to create versions of ChatGPT or iterations of the AI, of the large language model, that are good at getting past the Overton window or whatever else it is, I can see where they would actually help things become more accurate. Now, the deeper question there is accuracy, right? Which is people have different interpretations of history and they have different interpretations of what's going on. Part of the human condition is that it's a struggle to find truth. So, that's why you have peer review and you have double blind and you have all of these things that we do to try and get to truth, knowing that it's hard to get there. So I didn't have as negative a reaction as you did. I do think it's ironic to have to pay for accuracy, but I also think it's reasonable to believe that over the course of time, we may quite well use AI to improve AI.
Yeah. Well, I mean, a lot of people are doing that. A lot of the models. Now that you're talking about it, I'm kind of warming to the idea. It was just interesting that the way that they presented it in the beginning, it wasn't implying that they were using it, but of course, because it's sales, right? But a lot of AI, I think, OpenAI and Claude have been using models to train other models, and that's a common practice. It's basically it's reinforcement-led human learning, except without the human. It's another AI who's also been trained, so it's kind of passing. So that's really interesting. We are a bit almost out of time, so I won't do it. It's quite a big deep dive, but we have 3 articles on genetics and AI. And the first one, the most recent one, is that ex-meta scientists have created a gigantic AI protein design model. So it's hopefully going to help them identify and create proteins that will be relevant to disease research and mutation research. A lot of AI and genetics obviously are about pathology treatment and pathology discovery and diagnosing. And so it was really interesting that was a huge thing. And a lot of people weren't talking about it. I thought when I selected this for a deep dive, it was going to be really easy to find things, but there really weren't that many huge news stories about it. I had to go dig deep. People aren't really talking about this, but it's a company called Evolutionary Scale, and it is a massive, massive model, and it created new fluorescent proteins to aid in medicine and drug development, and it is just gigantic. The University of Wisconsin-Madison has been analyzing it, and all sorts of things. They have kind of made it compatible with CRISPR, which is a gene editing
Technology.
technology. And so they're incorporating this AI-made protein into existing best practices, and it's changing the field. I think they're doing it right. They're doing it really well. And it's really interesting to see what's going to happen with that, if people are going to disregard it. But a lot of people seem to be accepting it, and they're saying, yeah, they had a lot of human intervention. They had a lot of fact checking, peer review. They went through 88 different changes 88 different whole proteins. It wasn't just, altering it 88 times, 88 specific trials. And so really interesting to see how that's going. And related to that, AI is also, they're using AI to look at the genetics and the DNA of tumors to see how those are working and functioning, and how they respond to treatment. So treatment of tumors could be also assessed by and altered by AI. So that would be really interesting to see how that works out.
I haven't drilled down like you have on this particular story, but I do think that we're going to probably want to look for evidence of peer review.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah, again, there are going to be incentives for promises and the like, but this does feel fairly scientific, and it does feel like it's a really good fit with artificial intelligence. And I fully expect there are going to be very dramatic advances in medicine because of AI. And sort of as a corollary, the Ariana Huffington project with OpenAI, I think it's her company is called Thrive, and it's an OpenAI project. But being a health coach for people, I also think this is going to be huge. Maybe less scientific, but this ability to have a vast data set of information for people to identify health concerns, and especially given the sort of tragically high numbers of iatrogenic deaths, I think this is going to be an opportunity. I also would be very curious to know, is this a challenge or something that the pharmaceutical industry is worried about? Meaning the discovery of these things, are they going to be patented? Who's going to own the patents or the patent rights? How's the money going to flow in these situations? Because there's an enormous incentive to maintain financial dominance in marketplaces.
Well, it's interesting. As early as February of 2023, they've been trying to create AI designed drugs, but it kind of stalled. It hasn't really been doing much, and so it'll be interesting to see if that kind of kicks up again now that they're using AI to diagnose and create proteins and stuff like that. But I don't know if it'll. Who knows? Maybe it will. Maybe it won't. I don't know. I mean, how will the FDA respond? Is my question. But yeah, who knows? Um, yeah. Anything else you have seen this past week that you want to?
No, I think one of the themes of our productivity boot camp is going to be that there's such rapid change here
Mhm.
that it's more a focus on the way you think about it than the actual tool. So these tools are changing rapidly. The Perplexity added voice this week, somebody's
Oh,
going
yeah.
to add something next week. And then when ChatGPT 4.0 actually rolls out in a larger way, what's that going to be like? And what are the every week there's going to be some new big thing. So again, I think you and I have this sort of commitment. Let's think about the way we think rather than the tool, and understand the technique behind the use of the tool, so that when the tool changes, you're able to shift gears and use it in a different way, or use a different tool.
Mhm. That sounds good.
Okay,
Um,
what a
it'll-
good week.
yeah, that is a lot of stuff.
Thanks, Reed.
Yeah, no problem. See ya.
Bye.
Okay.